So the social and legal conditions for women in the 19th century are pretty stark, right? First off, women could not vote, of course, and they were not legally equal to men, right? You still have the influence of the idea of coverture, that women are not entities outside of their men or outside of the men in their lives. There were a few specific instances and a few ways in which a woman could kind of maybe have some legal standing, but it was very rare and very unusual. Most of the time, whether it was business, whether it was legal, whatever it was, the husband or male relative was her legal representative. She was kind of kept put away from everything. They did not have employment opportunities. They could work in factories, which is an employment opportunity, except, of course, that the wages go down and they face job competition from men. And the whole system begins to kind of unravel in the sense that it doesn't become kind of an elite option for women. It becomes just something everybody else can do. The women start getting lower wages, and it really kind of if you're lower class and you're looking at the factory system, you're getting lower wages. If you're middle class, you're extremely limited. You can maybe go be a teacher, maybe, but even that, of course, if you want to get married or anything like that, then you have to give up your job because married women weren't supposed to work, right? Which is another aspect, which is that what few limited employment opportunities there were, and emphasis underscore few. Once you got married or if you got pregnant, that door was closed, right? You were on your own. And so this is kind of one of the major problems. Limited educational opportunities. Most women of the middle and upper class were educated at home. A few might have been sent to boarding schools that were intended to teach them to be, fine, upstanding women, what spoon to use, how to carry yourself, what kind of dresses to pick out, that kind of thing. And yes, that did include basic literacy, but it doesn't really do much else besides that. Only in very specific instances, like with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, whose father kind of indulged her in reading his law books, right? So she becomes largely self-taught, based on her own readings and kind of interactions with her father, and then finds the door of opportunity shut to her. She couldn't do what she wanted to do. And so higher institutions are closed to women, and the handful of women that do manage to go be lawyers or doctors are the exception, not the rule. And they have very limited control of property. There is some change to that because, as I pointed out down there, the boom and bust cycles of the market economy convince men that, well, if I can protect some property in my wife's name, right? So you have, state by state, you might have some changes, but it's very inconsistent. It's not very specific. Doesn't really kind of give women extensive control, right? It just puts it in their name to kind of shield it for the family, if you will. And so typically that option is only going to help women who are involved with families that have wealth and property. And the men could still basically control everything. A working class man could confiscate his wife or his daughter's wages, and she would have no recourse. Like he could literally go to the paymaster and say, hey, give me my wife's wages, and they would give it to him, and there's nothing she could do about it, right? So this, really kind of, frustration with the issue of property and wages and being able to control what you make. So in that way, this is part of why women are very sympathetic to the abolition movement, because there's a real sense that women are really kind of a variation of a slave, right? If they work, their wages can be confiscated. If they're well-to-do and they have property, their property is controlled by somebody. They are not given any options about what they're allowed to develop. Their education is limited, and they're not allowed to criticize things. And so this is kind of why you see women being very sensitive to all of this. And of course, there's no rights in marriage. The husband could rape the wife. He could beat her, and that was considered perfectly okay. If she chose to leave her husband, she would leave everything, her children, her well-being, her economics, right? So women were incredibly kind of trapped in some bad marriages because of this. And again, like I said, you had some changes based on the market economy and the recognition that putting some things in women's name could be beneficial, but it varies by state, and there's no consistency with it. So that kind of creates a problem. And then this ideal of true womanhood, right? The cult of domesticity, that women were, how women were supposed to behave, how they were supposed to look, how they were supposed to think, what they were supposed to care about. So you really see that even in some of the reform movements, although you have women channeling the reform movements to really express themselves. But for a lot of women, this ideal of true womanhood, of what it meant to be the perfect woman, really establishes this really high bar. Women are not allowed to be just themselves and care about the things that they want. And the reality, of course, is incredibly different if you're working class, or especially if you're a slave. You don't have any of these rights. So the true womanhood cult of domesticity is largely reserved for women, white women of a particular social status, right? And so those women dealt with kind of that gilded cage, if you will, this kind of idea of being shut away or being very limited in what you can do. And then for the other women, the working class women and the slaves, it didn't apply to them in the first place. They were treated just like everybody else, except they didn't have as much power and as much right and as much, authority to speak, and were still incredibly vulnerable. So you've got this tension between kind of this message that comes out from society and kind of what women are having to deal with for the, in most cases, right? And of course, the prime example to that now is you think about the image of beauty and how women are supposed to look, right? And the reality, of course, is vastly different than what, gets kind of put out in the media. And so you kind of have that same, just to kind of give you a context into how that creates a tension between what everyone knows is real and what's portrayed as perfect, right? And then the next part that you want to kind of focus on is the early women's movement, right? And I say early women's movement because if you look at the women's movement as a kind of a chronology that kind of starts with the idea of, kind of Abigail Adams and this idea of women getting politically aware, sorry, that's my Yorkie. And then continues with the idea of women asking for the right to vote, and women kind of going state by state, and then women actually getting the right to vote, and then equal wages. All of those things kind of combined together, right? So this part here in the mid 1800s, around 1848, is seen as the early women's movement. Even though women had always been actively involved in politics, and there's numerous readings in the American Yop that kind of talk about kind of women's political action. But these women are seeing kind of the political dysfunction, right, that's coming out of the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, this question of the morality of slavery and the discussion about who should have rights makes them particularly aware, right, as well as the Second Great Awakening, the revivalism, this idea of action, right, that you should be actively involved in perfecting society. So you start to have women really kind of waking up. And again, it's not just the reform movements. They're also going to express this politically. Some of the names you want to know are Sarah and Angelina Grimke, of course, right? They argue for women's equality as well as for abolition. There's a couple of really good selections in the American Yop Reader. Lucretia Mott is another one, as is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who's the primary author of the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments. And the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments is kind of a fascinating document. And let's see if I can't pull it up here real quick. Well, we don't. Wikipedia is not always bad, but I prefer to look at the actual text. Okay, so here we go. The Declaration of Sentiments. So notice it starts off, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one portion of the family of man to assume among the people of the earth a different position, different from that which they have hitherto occupied, but one to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should decree the causes that impel them to such a course. So this connection with the Declaration of Independence, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and so forth and so on, that we don't have to change this because of light and transient causes. So again, again, kind of this cookie cutter. Then you start to see the list, right? The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, and having a direct object, the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. So think about Abigail Adams, right? All men would be tyrants, right? He's never allowed her to vote. He has forced her to submit to laws to which she has no say. He has withheld from her the rights and given them to ignorant and degraded men, both natives and foreigners. So a little bit of kind of anti-immigrant racism going on there. But this has to do with the idea that men that you have in the 1830s and 40s, kind of opening up the franchise, the ability to vote to more and more men, reducing property requirements in some cases down to zero. And these women are like, wait a minute, right? I'm smarter than these guys. I understand better. I'm higher class, right? Why are you letting these, ruffians vote? Basically, that she doesn't have representation. If she has married, she is in the eye of the law civilly dead. He takes from her rights of property, even the wages she earns. He's made her a morally responsible being, as she can commit crimes with impunity, provided they are done in the presence of her husband. This is the idea of covenant, or not covenant, coverture, that basically says that, she's like if she commits a crime with her husband there, her husband's the one who's accountable, and he can chastise her that she can't, that she's not accountable to law because she's basically morally incapable of making decisions, right? Laws of divorce, there's nothing she can do. He's depriving her the rights as a married woman, if single, and the owner of property. He's taxed her to support a government which recognizes her only when her property can be made profitable to it. He's monopolized the employments. And if she is allowed to find a job, she doesn't receive the same wages. He closes the avenues of wealth and distinction. She can't become a doctor or a lawyer. He's denied her the ability to go to colleges. He basically puts her in a subordinate position. He basically claims a different code of morals for himself over women. In other words, this has to do with sexuality and prostitution. He's basically decided, taken on the idea of God to decide what her sphere of action is. He's tried to destroy her powers and her confidence, and that this degradation is wrong, right? So this is what the Declaration of Sentiments is all about. And so Elizabeth Cady Stanton writes that. Of course, she's an interesting case. Again, I mentioned she had a brother who died, and her father was pretty grief-stricken, really kind of indulged Elizabeth Cady to read in his law office and talk things out with him, and he would argue cases and kind of have her preview things. And then when it got time for her to marry, and she wanted to marry Stanton, her dad was pretty upset because, oh my gosh, she thought for herself. So you have kind of this tension going on there. Sorry, it's my Yorkie. And so you have this tension going on between her and her dad, but then she goes on and gets married. But one of the frustrations she has is that she keeps getting pregnant, right? So she's always getting pregnant. She has like 7 kids or something like that. So she's largely trapped at the house. So she really feels kind of the limitations of being a wife and being a mother. And yet they have this Seneca Falls Convention, and she writes this incredible document, right? And Lucretia Mott backs it, as do Frederick Douglass and a number of men and like 68 women. And it proposes this series of rights, right? And it essentially kind of raises the bar for the women's movement. Now, as I said, this is going to be largely ridiculed and kind of pushed aside because the idea is, well, those silly women, right? And it's into this context that Amelia Bloomer is coming out with her bloomer pants, right? Which is actually, she does it as kind of a safety thing for women, that the big skirts women wear are not always very safe, except, of course, that gets ridiculed. And so the women's movement kind of gets shuffled to the side behind what is seen as the seriousness of abolition. Even though when you look at that Declaration of Sentiments, there's very real serious actions taking place there. So you want to kind of keep that in mind. So I'm going to stop here, and then the last section will be about the Civil War and kind of women's actions in the Civil War.